The final lock was older than the others, its surface pitted and blackened from years of damp. It had been meant as a final safeguard, the one that even desperate hands could never break without the ringmaster's key. The man's tool slid into it as if it had been made for the task. The moment his wrist twisted, the lock gave a brittle crack, the sound sharp enough to cut through the roar of the crowd. For an instant, time seemed to stall. The chain slid from her ankles on a sluggish coil, pulling at her feet. The weight she had carried for as long as she could remember was gone. Her balance shifted wildly, and she caught herself on instinct, her bare toes gripping the slick platform. The air felt different, bigger, sharper, every raindrop suddenly distinct. Against her skin, the handlers reacted too late. One surged forward, shock-proud raised, but the man caught him mid-step, driving a shoulder into his ribs and sending him spinning into the rail. The second handler hesitated, fear warring with training, and that pause sealed his fate. The man grabbed his prod, twisted it free, and flung it aside dot above. The guards had reached the inner rail. Crossbows were leveled, and orders were barked through the downpour. The crowd split in their allegiance, some shouting for blood, others urging escape, their voices blending into a frenzy that fed the storm. Lightning flashed, illuminating the wet iron bars and the faces pressed against them. Wide-eyed and hungry for whatever would happen next, the man glanced back at her, the shadow of his hood slipping just enough for her to see his eyes. They weren't the cold, calculating eyes of the handlers or the dull gaze of the ringmaster's thugs. They were alive, sharp with intent, fierce with a kind of defiance she had only ever felt in dreams. "Go," he said, and though the word was soft, it cut through the chaos like a blade. Her legs felt alien beneath her, untested in freedom, but she moved first to stagger, then a run. She didn't look back to see if he followed. She didn't need to. She could hear him behind her, his boots striking the metal in a rhythm that matched her own, keeping pace as if he had been running alongside her for a lifetime. Bolts hissed through the rain, embedding themselves in the platform where she had been a heartbeat before. The gates ahead yawned open not by design, but because someone, somewhere in the shadows, had thrown them wide. And beyond those gates, for the first time, she saw something other than the ring's enclosing walls. It was the city, vast, dark, and waiting. The rain thickened under the high stone arches that framed the ring's outer wall, turning the cobbles into a slick mosaic of black and silver. The smell changed here, less of smoke and oil, more of wet stone, rotting wood, and the faint metallic tang of the drainage channels that cut between the alleys. She had never been beyond the walls, and the sheer size of everything was dizzying. Buildings loomed like dark cliffs, windows glowing faintly behind warped glass, shadows twitching as people inside caught the sound of running feet. The man didn't slow. His coat streamed behind him, shedding rain in a sharp spray with every turn. He knew these streets, or at least moved as if he did, ducking into narrow gaps, stepping over uneven stones without looking, pulling her with him when her steps faltered. Behind them, shouts rose and fell, the echo of armored boots chasing through the streets like distant thunder. The guards weren't far, but the city had its own ways of hiding those who could keep moving. A sudden flicker of torchlight bloomed ahead as a patrol rounded the far corner, crossbows raised. She froze, instincts screaming to retreat. The man didn't. With a sharp tug, he pulled her into the mouth of an alley so narrow she had to turn sideways to slip between the walls. The torchlight flared brighter for a second, then passed, the patrol storming past without a glance. She could feel her own breath coming fast, warm against the cold wetness of her hair. The chains that still hung from her wrists clinked quietly when she moved, and she hated the sound. It marked her, even. Now something taken, the man noticed too. He reached into a pouch at his belt and produced a short, flat tool. With quick, deliberate movements, he pried the last of the shackles from her wrists, letting them drop silently to the alley floor. For the first time since she could remember, she was wearing no metal at all. They moved again, but this time the path dipped sharply downward, leading toward the deeper parts of the city where the light barely reached. The air here was thicker, carrying the scent of wet iron and something faintly electric. Somewhere above, the sound of boots was fading, replaced by the restless patter of rain on the rooftops. When they finally stopped, it was under the crumbling arch of an abandoned tram station. The man scanned the shadows before speaking. "They'll seal the upper street soon," he said. "If we stay there, we're done." She studied him in the gloom, noting the quiet precision in his voice, the lack of wasted words. Whoever he wasn't just someone who wandered into the ring on a whim. He had planned this for her. Before she could speak, a low hum began to build beneath their feet, deep, mechanical, and rising. Something was coming. The hum deepened into a throbbing vibration that seemed to crawl up through the soaked cobbles, rattling her bones. It wasn't the sound of horses or the grinding wheels of a cart. This was cleaner, sharper, and engineered rhythm she had never heard before, like the low growl of something that was alive but built of steel. The man stepped away from her and into the open mouth of the platform, rain catching in the folds of his coat as he scanned the shadows below. Then, without warning, a shape detached itself from the darkness, a squat, armored vehicle no bigger than a market stall, its matte plating slick with water. Twin strips of pale blue light cut the night on either side of its prow, glinting off the riveted edges. The hum came from deep within its chassis, pulsing with the slow confidence of a predator that had no reason to hurry. It stopped at the base of the archway. Panels on its side irised open with a faint hiss, revealing a small cabin lit by the same blue glow. The man jumped down onto the lower platform, boots striking wet steel, and gestured for her to follow. The motion was firm but not impatient. He moved like someone who understood exactly how much time they didn't have. She dropped down beside him, her bare feet slapping against the slick metal. The inside of the machine was warmer, its air carrying the faint scent of ozone and oil. She ducked into the narrow space, brushing against padded walls that had clearly been patched and reinforced many times. This was no polished city patrol. Craft it was old, stubborn, and built for slipping through places the authorities couldn't reach. As soon as she was inside, the panels sealed shut with a smooth hiss, shutting out the rain and the distant echo of boots. The man slid into the front seat, his hands moving over a console lined with mismatched switches and glowing dials. The hum shifted, climbing into a higher register, and she felt the floor vibrate beneath her as the machine began to move slow. At first, then faster, gliding along unseen rails buried deep beneath the city. She pressed a hand to the wall, feeling the steady pulse of its engine like a heartbeat. This was escape in motion, a thing she hadn't dared imagine. But as they shot into the tunnels, the dim light catching the planes of the man's face beneath his hood, she saw no relief there. Only focus. They'll know where we're going, he said quietly, as if speaking to himself. We just have to get there first. The tunnel ahead split into 3 yawning paths, each marked by a faint smear of light. The man didn't hesitate. He drove straight into the darkest one, the tunnel. Narrowed walls slick with condensation that caught the faint blue glow of the machine's running lights. Pipes lined the ceiling, dripping water in irregular beats, each drop sounding unnaturally loud in the cramped space. She kept her hand on the wall, the cold seeping into her fingers, the vibration of the engine humming through her bones. The man didn't slow, eyes fixed on the black ahead as if he could see farther than the lights allowed. They broke into a wider chamber, an underground junction where half-collapsed platforms jutted over a stagnant pool. The air was heavier here, thick with the tang of rust and old oil. But it wasn't the smell that made her tense, it was the silence. No echo of dripping water from above. No distant rumble of other trams. Just the low purr of their own engine. Too loud in the stillness. The man brought the machine to a stop beside a rusted catwalk. He killed the engine with the flick of his wrist, and the quiet that followed was suffocating. They should have been here, he muttered, more to himself. Then to her. She wanted to ask who, but her voice caught before it could form. Something moved in the shadows on the far side of the chamber, too smooth, too deliberate to be debris shifting. A faint metallic scrape followed, then another, coming closer. The man's posture tightened when the first figure stepped into the light. She understood his reaction. It wasn't a guard in city armor. It wasn't even entirely human. The thing's face was a mask of pale alloy, eyes glowing faintly red behind slits. The rest of its body a patchwork of flesh and mechanical. Plating. The chains on its arms rattled softly, though it carried no visible weapon. Two more emerged behind it, their footsteps falling in perfect, unnatural rhythm. The man didn't reach for a gun. Instead, his hand dropped to a small metal sphere, clipped to his belt. He turned his head just enough to catch her gaze. Stay low. When it hits, we move. The nearest machine creature tilted its head, almost curious, then broke into a sudden, jarring sprint. The man thumbed the sphere's side, and with a sharp twist, it began to glow from within, light spilling through edge lines like veins of fire. He threw it. The chamber exploded in white. The blast was not heat, not fire, just light so pure it erased the chamber in an instant. It clawed into her eyes, burned through the shape of her own hands when she lifted them in reflex. The metallic creatures shrieked in a sound that wasn't quite mechanical and wasn't quite human, staggering as their glowing eyes dimmed too. Nothing. Somewhere in the whiteness, she felt the man's hand close around her arm, pulling her forward with a force that brooked no hesitation. Her feet barely found purchase on the slick catwalk before he shoved her toward a gap in the wall. An old maintenance hatch, its edges warped and crusted with rust. He didn't waste time checking if it was clear. He ducked through, dragging her with him. The stale air inside the narrow tunnel, heavy with dust. Behind them, the light was fading, shapes starting to claw their way back into being, the twitching. Shadows of the machines as they staggered, their systems struggling to recover. One of them let out a distorted bellow, a sound like metal tearing under too much strain. The man didn't slow. His boots hammered the grated floor, the sound ringing down the tunnel. They'll recover fast, he said, breath even despite the pace. We make the next turn before they do, or they'll box us in. The tunnel bent sharply, then dropped into a steep spiral of stairs that descended into a deeper dark. The man took them two at a time, the wet edges hissing under his boots. She tried to keep up, her lungs aching with the effort, but every time her foot faltered, his grip tightened just enough to steady her without breaking stride. They burst out into another chamber, smaller, lower ceiling, walls lined with silent machinery that looked centuries old. He crossed to the far side, hands working quickly over a recessed panel. A hidden door slid aside with a whisper, revealing a cramped compartment barely big enough for both of them. She ducked inside, feeling the air shift as the panel slid shut again, sealing them in total darkness. She could still hear the distant echoes, the heavy, perfect cadence of the machine steps getting closer. They don't quit, she whispered. No, he said in the dark. But neither do I. Something in his voice wasn't bravado. It was fact cold, immovable, like the steel that had just kept them alive. The darkness didn't last. A faint amber glow began to seep through seams in the wall, outlining the narrow compartment. With a quiet hiss, a second panel slid open on the opposite side, revealing a tunnel unlike the others, wider, rounder, lined with ancient steel ribs that disappeared into a haze of dust and distance. The air smelled stale, as if it had been trapped here for decades. But beneath that was another scent ozone, faint but fresh. Something had been moving here recently. The man stepped out first, scanning the tunnel with the precision of someone who had walked this place in his mind long before setting foot in it. Old tram lines, he said, decommissioned before most of the upper city was even built. If we're lucky, the systems are still buried deep enough the patrol scanners can't reach us. And if we're not lucky, she asked, then we'll know fast. He started forward, his pace but deliberate, boots crunching on gravel where the old rails had rusted through. The tunnel curved in long, lazy arcs, the sound of their steps swallowed almost instantly by the thick air. Every so often he'd stop, crouch, and run his fingers along the wall as if feeling for something unseen. Once he tapped a section twice, listening, then adjusted their path slightly to avoid a particular stretch of floor dot. After nearly 10 minutes, they reached a section where the tunnel widened into a service bay. Ancient vehicles sat in skeletal rows, their shells flaking under centuries of damp. A few still had shattered glass in their windows, but most were little more than frames. At the far end, a set of sealed bulkhead doors loomed, their surface covered in layers of warning symbols too faded to read. "That's our way out," he said, crossing to a small control column beside the doors. His hands moved over the cracked surface, brushing away grime until a faint panel of light came to life. The display stuttered, lines of alien text flickering briefly before resolving into something readable. She stepped closer, eyes drawn to the old symbols. "The system's not human," she murmured. "No," he agreed without looking up. "It isn't." The console gave a low, steady tone, and the bulkhead doors began to grind open, dust billowing into the air. Through the widening gap, she saw another tunnel beyond this one, cleaner, lined with faint strips of light that ran unbroken into the dark. The man's shoulders tensed. "Once we're in there, no turning back. This line runs straight under the city's last barrier. If anything follows us in, it'll follow all the way through." She wanted to ask what was on the other side, but the sound reached them before. She could speak faint at first, then building. A metallic rhythm, perfect and relentless. The machines had found the old lines, the sound of pursuit sharpened into individual footfalls, heavy, precise, too evenly spaced to be anything human. It echoed off the old steel ribs of the tunnel, turning the air itself into a drumbeat of inevitability. The man didn't hesitate. He caught her arm, steering her toward the newly opened bulkhead as dust still hung thick in the air. They crossed the threshold into the Forbidden's line, the ground shifting subtly beneath their feet. The rails here weren't corroded. They gleamed faintly under strips of pale light embedded in the walls. The air felt cleaner, but it carried a faint electric bite that prickled against her skin. The man glanced back only once, his gaze locking on the narrowing gap of the bulkhead doors. In that heartbeat, a shadow moved there, tall, angular, and unmistakably mechanical. He swore under his breath and slapped a recessed panel on the inside wall. The doors groaned, but instead of sealing fully, they froze halfway. "That'll buy us seconds, not minutes," he said. They broke into a run. The tunnel seemed to stretch endlessly ahead, its curves smooth and unbroken. Every few meters, narrow alcoves opened into shadowed maintenance spaces. The man's eyes flicked to each one, calculating, searching. At the third alcove, he darted in, yanking open a metal crate half buried in dust. Inside, she glimpsed faded harnesses, old battery packs, and most importantly, a coiled cable ending in a magnetized clamp. "Help me," he said, already dragging the cable toward the rail. She crouched, holding the heavy coil steady while he worked the clamp onto the smooth metal. Sparks bit the air as the connection locked, and a faint hum began to pulse through the line. He clipped the other end to a small, battered control box, then flicked a series of switches in rapid succession. The tunnel's lights flickered. Somewhere far ahead, something deep and mechanical groaned awake. A low vibration rolled through the floor, gathering strength until it became a steady, throbbing tremor. "What did you just do?" she asked. "Woke it up," he said, snapping the cable free. "Old transit drone. If it's still functional, it'll give us speed they can't match." A metallic crash behind them cut short any reply. The machines had forced the bulkhead, their silhouettes now spilling into the tunnel's glow. The man grabbed her hand and pulled hard. "Run." The tremor beneath their feet was growing faster. Now something was coming toward them from the dark ahead. The rain didn't fall so much as it hissed, needling through the air in fine, cold threads that stung when they touched bare skin. The iron platform was slick beneath her knees, the shallow puddles trembling with the bass thrum of the crowd. Beyond the gates, somewhere above, torches spat and popped, their flames bending in the wind, sending the smell of oil and wet smoke down to mingle with the copper tang of rust. She did not shiver, not because she was warm, but because she had long since learned that movement only made the chains bite deeper. The iron cuffs around her wrists were blackened with years of use, their insides worn smooth by the endless struggling of Faye, said she had been found in the wreckage of something not made by human hands, washed ashore after a storm so violent it carved new scars into the cliffs. That was the story the ringmasters told the paying masses anyway. Whether it was true no longer mattered. It was the only truth she was allowed to have. No name, no home, no past, only the spectacle. The crowd loved to imagine her as a dangerous prize, a rare creature kept caged for their entertainment. It was easier to cheer for the breaking of something if you first believed it had been wild and cruel dot from her place in the center of the ring. She could see the tiers of faces forming a living wall, their shadows deep and restless under the torchlight. Their voices rose in surging waves, jeers, laughter, the occasional whistle that cut through like a blade. A bell clanged once, heavy and low, and the crowd fell into a taut silence that hummed with expectation. The handlers would come soon. They always came after the first bell. And when they did, the locks would not be opened, they would be tested. Pulled, tightened. Her world was made of metal and noise, and each night it closed a little more around her. Yet beneath the surface of the noise, she felt something different tonight. It was in the rhythm of the rain, and the way the torches seemed to flare brighter between gusts of wind, in the prickling awareness crawling up her spine. The air beyond the gates carried a different scent: wet leather, cold steel, and the faint ozone bite of weapon capacitors warming up. Not from the handlers, not from the crowd. From someone else. Someone who was moving against the tide of the spectacle. The chains pulled against her as she shifted, slow and deliberate, her eyes tracking the edges of the gate where the shadows were deepest. The audience would not notice, they never did. But she did, and somewhere beyond the clanging metal and the shouting voices, she thought she heard the sound of footsteps. Not the heavy, practiced stomp of guards, but the steady, unhurried pace of someone who had come here for a reason that had nothing to do with the crowd's amusement dottos who came before her. The second bell was louder, sharper, like the crack of something breaking in half. The crowd roared back to life, all teeth and greed, stamping their feet until the metal steps rattled. The platform beneath her thrummed with their hunger. She kept her gaze lowered, letting the curtain of her damp hair hide her eyes, though. Every nerve in her body strained toward the source of that earlier sound, the measured tread that didn't belong here. The rain seemed to thin, each drop sharper, colder, as if the world itself were bracing for something. The handlers emerged first, just as expected, their boots leaving shallow splashes in the water pooling across the ring. They carried the usual. Tools-crooked poles tipped with shock prods, heavy keys dangling from chains at their belts, and faces locked into the blank, bored expressions of men who had long since stopped seeing the people they handled as anything more than livestock. One of them knelt beside her, fingers brushing the chain where it linked to the floor. He tugged it sharply, not to test the metal, but to remind her who was in control. The crowd laughed at that, a quick, ugly sound, but then the laughter faltered. Not much, just a ripple, a hesitation, but enough for her to notice. The cause stepped into view a moment later. He didn't belong to them. No uniform, no weapon in hand. Just a long, dark coat that clung to him in the wet, the brim of his. Hood shadowing his face. He moved through the handlers as though they weren't there, forcing them to shift aside without a word. The chains on her wrists tingled faintly, as if reacting to his presence, though she knew that was impossible. He stopped just short of her, the rain dripping from the edge of his hood, and for a heartbeat, no one moved. The handlers glanced toward the gate as if expecting someone to stop him. No one did. She could feel the crowd leaning forward in their seats, sensing something unscripted. Her pulse picked up in quiet defiance of her stillness. He was close enough now that she could see the faint glint of metal at his hip, not a prod, not a whip, but the grip of a lockbreaker's tool, one she'd only ever seen used in the scrap markets far from here. When he finally spoke, it wasn't loud enough for the audience to hear, just a low murmur meant for her alone. And though she couldn't make out the words over the roar of the storm and the restless shuffle of the crowd, she recognized something older than language in the sound promise. Not the empty kind the ringmasters gave before a fight, not the cruel bargain of the handlers. This was different. This was the sound of someone who had come to end things. Somewhere in the stands, a horn sounded, shrill and urgent. The handlers straightened, their grips tightening on their prods. Whatever was about to happen was no longer part of the show. Horn's cry cut the night in two, and for the briefest heartbeat, the crowd didn't know whether to cheer or run. That hesitation was all it took. The man in the dark coat stepped closer, the glint of the lockbreaker flashing in his hand, rain sliding off the polished steel. One of the handlers lunged, jabbing a prod toward his side, but the man pivoted, just enough that the strike glanced harmlessly off his coat. The return movement was so fluid it almost looked accidental, his elbow catching the handler, square in the chest and sending him sprawling backward into the mud. The crowd gasped as though tasting something forbidden. No one touched the handlers? Not here. Not in the ring. She barely had time to register the sound before the man crouched in front of her, the shadow of his hood shielding her from the worst of the torchlight. The lockbreaker slipped into the first cuff with a smooth, practiced motion, its tip fitting into the worn grooves left by years of desperation. A twist, a click, and the pressure on her wrist vanished so abruptly it left the skin beneath tingling. Her first instinct was to flinch, to pull back, expecting the crackle of a prod or the heavy yank of the chain, but it didn't come. He was already moving to the second cuff, his hand steady, even as the handlers recovered from their shock. The nearest of them shouted something, drowned beneath the crowd's shifting voice, half uproar, half awe. The second handler rushed in, but the man didn't look up. His free hand shot out, grabbing the handler's arm and wrenching it aside, sending the prod skittering across the wet platform with a shriek of metal on metal. The audience reacted like predators scenting blood, voices rising to a fever pitch. Second lock gave way with a sharp, almost joyful snap. For the first time in years, she could move her arms freely. The weight of the chain still hung from her wrists, but it was no longer anchored to the floor, no longer dictating the limits of her world. The sensation was dizzying, like breathing after being held underwater too long. She could have stayed still, but something deep in her bones urged otherwise. The man rose, stepping between her and the handlers as the third and final lock glimmered in the torchlight. Somewhere above them, guards were pushing through the crowd, their armor clattering. The show was collapsing into chaos. The horn sounded again, this time longer, louder, desperate, and through all of it, the man's voice cut through, quiet and certain, meant only for her. When I break this one, you run.